Hello, everybody. It's always a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Forest Speaks Committee. It's a special pleasure this afternoon because we have the auditorium back. And so we can really welcome you to our usual space where we can seat lots of you to hear an interesting program. That's all I'm going to say, except to remind you to cut off your devices if you have them with you, please. Okay. And then I'm going to turn the program over to Gail Benjamin, who's going to be introducing our speaker.
Good afternoon. I'm Gail Benjamin, and I'm here to introduce my husband, Dave Bobrow, whom I have known for 50-odd years now. Somewhere long. So Dave was born in Boston, but moved when he was a child to Tucson, a place that he regarded as a good place to grow up, but one that his parents never really took to. However, living with him, I have come to learn that his life really began when he went to the University of Chicago. He loved the university, he loved the academic life and the social life. He loved the fencing team, and he loved the city. It was exciting. He first became involved in politics, the local political elections, and began a long tradition of supporting losing candidates. After Chicago, he went to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and after that to MIT, where he got his PhD in a new political science program that emphasized data analysis over historical analysis. After graduate school, he worked for the US government at the Oak Ridge Laboratories and at the Pentagon, where he was in charge of social science research for the Advanced Research Projects Administration. After that, he left and spent the rest of his career in academia. He went first to the University of Minnesota, which is where we met, then the University of Maryland and the University of Pittsburgh. He's written several books on policy analysis and on foreign relations, many articles and conference papers. He's also served as a consultant to a number of groups, including the Defense Science Board and the Science and Technology Advisory Panel to the Director of the CIA. We spent several years living overseas in Japan and Israel. He was in Germany and shorter stints in other countries where he was studying foreign relations. And I was doing anthropology with the aid of our children. If you ever really want to know about life in other cultures, take children with you. They're an invaluable access point for learning about what's going on. Well, probably not foreign relations, though. So I've also heard Dave talk on this topic a number of times to foreign officers while he was doing lecture tours for the State Department and USAID, whatever it was called in those years. And I think you will enjoy it and recognize some consistent themes from your lifetime.
Well, how's the volume? Loud enough to higher? Good. Okay. So thank you all for coming. Thank Gail for the introduction. She let me off pretty easily. And thank Emma for all the logistics help. I'm going to talk a bit tonight about international insecurity, which is, I think, an accurate term. And that means about threats that cross borders. They can be military, they can be economic, they can be environmental, they can be health threats, all kinds of possibilities. They can even be threats to value systems, ideological threats. And in particular, I want to talk about how conventionally weaker governments can keep stronger ones, in conventional terms, from getting what they want. Uh, That doesn't mean the weaker will get everything they want, but they can get in the way of the strong, huh? Forestall, frustrate, mitigate demands, and so forth and so on. Okay. This is a timely topic, obviously, but I'm not going to focus in my remarks on the current administration because it is a recurrent pattern, from my point of view, in international affairs, where the stronger get carried away a bit and then get disappointed. Uh, so the negative outcomes, I feel, are more likely when the stronger powers, leaders, and their publics get caught up in some recurrent fallacies and fantasies. So after telling you a little bit about my professional origin story, which has certainly shaped my views, I'm going to turn to some of the fallacies and fantasies, and then to some of what the smaller and weaker can do. Okay. So my origin story is that I never have had any influence over much of anything, including the children who were with us as we traveled. But I did spend a lot of time, maybe too much time, observing at relatively close hand how people who do have influence, particularly over American policies, um, uh, arrive at their positions, both their career positions and their policy positions. And I also spent a lot of time with foreigners, international relations types, including a lot of America watchers. And many of them were very knowledgeable about how their governments and populations dealt with the more powerful. And they also were sometimes willing to either explicitly or implicitly share insights into what worked and what didn't work for them, for their weaker countries. Okay. Now, um, I have been called about half the time a naive pacifist, and another half the time a militarist warmonger. So you can decide whether that means I was 100% right or 100% wrong, or someplace in between. But I think any profession, people in any profession have an origin story. Is it working? Emma, where are you? Okay, so I'll just keep talking. So as a child, I do remember hearing about Pearl Harbor on the radio when it happened. Um, okay, I remember hearing about Pearl Harbor, and I remember going to newsreels. The nice thing about this audience is you will remember what some of my examples refer to. And the newsreels were, of course, were full of World War II. Uh, good. Um, and horrible things. Huh? The, the death march from Bataan and Corregidor. Um, and I also remember reading about a little later when I was um, literate uh, about horrible things being done, usually by the weaker parties, almost never, to my recollection, by the stronger parties. So, the barbaric losers of my childhood, it might be Japanese, they might be Native Americans, and so forth and so on. You get the picture. Um, so then I went to Chicago, and I'll come back to the intellectual origins. But when I was 20, I was going to school in England, and I took advantage of the breaks to travel. So here I am, 20 years old. It's 1956, and I'm walking through rubble in London, in Berlin, in Warsaw. And it struck me that this was 10 years after World War II ended. And how the hell could that have been worth it? And then a few years later, well, at the time and later, I visited extermination sites, uh, including at least one where some of my relatives were killed. Uh, um, and that led me to recognize that both the more powerful and the weak were capable of doing truly terrible things. So I didn't come out of any of that as either as a pacifist. I do think there are necessary wars, but I also became quite convinced that whether their intentions were well-meaning or not, policy elites left to their own devices would screw up. Not because they wanted to necessarily, but because there were hard choices to make and because they made them, as we all do, infallible ways. Now, academically, um, at Chicago, I read a Greek historian called, did Emma, you take the clicker? Got to watch her all the time. Let's see if it works. Okay. So I read Thucydides. Thucydides was a very smart guy who lived more than 2,500 years ago. And he's famous for writing a history of the Peloponnesian Wars. He also was a general himself, right? And so if you think about uh, um, what Thucydides is most famous for, it's for his dictum, his law, supposedly. The weak must do whatever they have to do, which means the strong can do whatever they want, and the weak had better comply. And it's called the Melian experience. Melos was a neutral city. Um, and the Athenians said, no, you can't be neutral. You have to uh, join up with us as we fight Sparta. And the Melians said, we don't want to. And the Athenians proceeded to kill all the men and take the women and children into captivity and slavery. So the moral of the story, supposedly, is if you're weak, give in. Don't resist, because you'll be very sorry if you do. And if you're strong, you can make demands, and a realist, weaker party will comply. Now, so that was Thucydides. But then I took the courses with Hans Morgenthau. Morgenthau was sort of the key figure in security thinking at the beginning of the Cold War. And he had published a book, which was very famous. Now, Morgenthau recognized that the ability of the strong depended on domestic cohesion, domestic unity. And to the extent that that was lacking, the strong could not maintain their strength, their position of dominance. So for Morgenthau, it was crucial to understand what would happen domestically in the strong state while it was pursuing its ambitions. Okay. Now, so my take from Thucydides was, wait a minute, who won the Peloponnesian War? And the answer is Athens was fundamentally weakened and really never recovered from the Peloponnesian War, which took about 30 years, like the Cold War was about 30 years. And my take from Morgenthau was, if the great power is doing something which ends up undermining domestic unity and legitimacy, it's not sustainable. And a wise great power elite will understand that and act accordingly. So then, when I was a student at Oxford, I went to some lectures by George Kennan. And Kennan was the author of, which appeared in article in Foreign Affairs by X. He was also one of the first post-World War I American experts on the Soviet Union. He, as a young man, he was assigned to the Baltics. He spent World War II largely in Moscow. And then he came back and headed the State Department planning staff. So Kennan's big idea was what he called containment. And at these lectures, he said that's not the same thing as encroachment. It's not the same thing as rollback. You remember any of these phrases from the Cold War? And certainly not the same thing as humiliation, what the Russians call degradatia, degradation. Cannon then went on in these lectures, the Reith lectures, to say, how can we be sure that the odds are good for a wise foreign policy, a wise international and security policy? And his answer was, oh, you need a wise ruling group, right? Like Plato's guardians. Okay. And then he said, now, I don't know how to guarantee that. And then maybe 15, 20, 25 years later, he realized that maybe we didn't have one anymore, that the world was not full of these wise, prudent, well-informed, patient elites, but full of real people. Okay, so that's the intellectual origin. You can see, and we'll see in what comes later, how they influence me. So let's get on to some fallacies. And these are fallacies that I view as being held by the strong in relative terms. The weaker don't have their own history. They have our knowledge of our history, remember the our, or they have our view of their history, but they don't have their own history. So Vietnam has not been holding off China for centuries. If you take that seriously, that view, that fallacy, what you'll see is that, of course, you can't understand the aspirations and the expectations that that party has, the weaker party has, or the people have. Right? Instead, you have this very partial and probably largely irrelevant view of them. Think about our understanding of places we've gone into, about their history of their history. The next fallacy, quite common, is that if a weaker party is under your security umbrella, they're happy, they're confident. Well, that's really nice if it happens. Why would you assume that? I think, again, if you don't understand their history. So we talk about Hungary, the current Hungarian government, accommodation with the Russians, with Putin. But do we talk about Hungary being abandoned by the US in 1956, 57? Which they were. Huh? They were encouraged to revolt, and then we didn't back them up. Let's go to the next fallacy. You guys still with me? Okay. Okay. The over optimism that the costs to the great power won't be that bad. They won't be that big. We won't have to stay that long. It'll be, to take a phrase from about the Spanish American War, a glorious little war. All right. Okay. Um, there's another one. False extrapolation. The great power believing, knowing it's great, strong, mighty, right? Really thinks that that means that that general power margin applies to specific situations, right? After all, look how small those Vietnamese are. Remember the little Japanese with buck teeth, right? Okay, and funny outfits and things like that. Well, of course, they we will have the great power thinks almost automatic situational superiority. Well, situation is the situation. We also tend to think that um, more general modernity means we'll have information advantages and bargaining skill advantages. We discount local knowledge. But local is where threats are coped with. They are not coped with in some abstract universe. They're localized. And this is the last one, this set. Cost. So our premise is that the strong, having done their own account of their superiority, believe that the cost to the weak of pursuing the conflict will be too great. So the weak will ultimately fold, even if they weren't intelligent enough to fold initially. Uh, Now, the problem, of course, is that the weak may not have any other place to go, and they know it. The weak may also have experiences back to the history of being able to sustain a weaker position, but a resistance position for decades. Uh, think about the Vietnamese, or think about the Chinese communists in the wilderness, literally, right, for 20 years before they came to power. Okay, so these fallacies and fantasies get in the way. They get in the way of Thucydides, Morgenthau, and Kennan. So the final part of what gets in the way is something I'm sure none of you are guilty of, and that's called the unitary actor fallacy. And the unitary actor fallacy basically treats governments and people's populations as if they were one person, single brain, single body, single nervous system, and so forth, right? So you don't, it's nice, it's really simple. It's easier to talk about things that way, right? Russia will, the United States did, and so forth and so on. The problem is it's unrealistic, totally unrealistic for pretty much everybody everywhere all the time. So here's this one at least, this view graph says, oh, there is somebody else in the world, A and B, each unitary actors, but what they're doing with each other isn't action reaction. It's as if they were living in basically separate, everything's one way. Huh? Now, obviously, that's pretty unrealistic. So at least in this one, now it's action reaction, right? The Russians did this, the Chinese did that, right? We did this. Okay, so that's more sophisticated, but in fact, not enough. So, oh, the great power does have domestic politics. Oh dear, we have to deal with something, with some aspects of our own population. We have to convince them we're being patriotic, effective, reasonable, and so forth and so on. We're alert to threats, we're alert to opportunities, all that stuff. Okay, so now we have a domestic political, economic, social system that we have to keep our eye on, uh even if we're not a democracy, but certainly if we are a democracy. All right, that's a little bit better, but we still have to recognize that the other side has a domestic system to deal with. Ah, yes, all right. That's good. We're recognizing that now. So when Zelensky shoots his mouth off, as some people thought he did, at the White House, Zelensky has a domestic system to deal with. And one of the ways of dealing with it is standing up to power. Okay. Now that's already getting to be a lot of work, right? I mean, figuring all that out, paying attention to all that, but it's worse because pieces of each domestic system are interacting with each other, right? Quite deliberately. Uh-huh. You think I'm done? No, it's still worse. So we go to the next one. Uh, wow. And so, for example, an American military aircraft manufacturer runs around Warsaw in the early 80s after wall fall, says, would you like to join NATO? We can help you join NATO by lobbying if you will promise to buy our fighter planes once you get in. Or if you believe that in smoking is a threat, um, and the U.S. is going into an international negotiation about the anti-smoking, anti-tobacco convention, who is staffing the other countries who are pushing this limiting agreement? An American nonprofit. See, that's that arrow. And so it goes. So, okay, what's someone to do? Does this mean that a great power doesn't have anybody in their system who knows about this stuff? Of course not. We all do. We usually do. It's a question of who gets listened to when and believed. Uh, all right. So you can understand then why it's tough being a great power foreign policy decision maker, even if you are very much one of Kennan's platonic elites. Okay, now what can the weaker do? This is the last chunk. Well, they have some latitude about arenas. They have some assets, and they have a repertoire of moves, of things to do. So, and they may be able to have some ability to influence what arena an issue is played out in, what assets they think they have, and what moves they can use to deal with a great power. Right? It's not much different than daily life, really, if you think about that. So one choice is, does it get played out in the weaker's homeland? Okay. As, let's say, a great power invasion. Does it get played out in the stronger's homeland? Think about the IRA bombings in London, right? No one would say the IRA was stronger than the British military, but okay. Does it get played out in a third party location? Like the Gulf, Persian Gulf. Um, do you pursue it in an international organization where the stronger power is a member, like NATO, United Nations, Kyoto Protocol? Or do you pursue it in one where they're not a member? World Court, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Okay. This is not solely the choice of the great power. So the arena part sort of proliferates in all kinds of groups you've never heard of. And I won't burden you with a list, but it's a very long list. Okay, so what do we small powers have to work with? Well, maybe it's our location or our mineral endowments. Huh? So think about Qatar. Qatar is a small piece of desert with a very good location, right? Where it can obstruct the Gulf. Straits in the traditional geopolitics, sitting on a strait, a major commercial or military passageway, gave you a lot of influence if you could use it. In the contemporary world, we talk a lot about supply chains. If you think about the role of, say, Taiwan in the semiconductor supply chain, it's totally disproportionate to their general military power or even their general economic power. Right? I do not think it is an accident that Taiwan decided to push chip manufacturing. I think it was a deliberate choice and that they were searching for ways of getting some leverage on the rest of the world, particularly the US and Japan. Market significance. If you have a major domestic producer, whether food, whatever, and you are the primary buyer in the world, that gives you some influence, something you can hold over the head of the great, stronger power. And of course, there's always damage inflicting capacity. And so France has perhaps 200 nuclear weapons that can reach Russia. So you might say, oh, 200 nuclear weapons. That's the pittance. Uh-huh. And de Gaulle's answer would be, no, it's sufficient. It's sufficient, right? Yeah, it only takes one to do a lot of damage. So this notion of the sufficiency becomes rather crucial. And that the small can somewhat compensate for their smallness if they have even a token of damage inflicting capacity. And then, of course, there's damage tolerance. Suppose the strong lead the weak to believe that they are indifferent to casualties. Well, my gosh, they're indifferent to pain. If someone is indifferent to pain, think about it as a human analogy. It means it's very hard to inflict enough pain to get them to behave the way you want. So, in some ways, I believe the Chinese did not mind during the Korean War, where we cultivated the view that they were indifferent to their casualties, indifferent to the human life, unlike us. Uh, okay, so there are some other assets which may be talked about a little less, but I think they really matter. One is a diaspora, an influential diaspora. And, the common example here is, of course, Jews and Israel. But I would also suggest Indians and the Indian diaspora, which is increasingly powerful in the US. And it doesn't have to be a very big diaspora. It just needs, in this decomposed domestic foreign political system, it may just need one. So, for example, the Greek diaspora in the US had Senator Sarbanes, my classmate at Oxford, and he was, a wonderful senator from my point of view. I'm not Greek, right? But he was the go to guys for the Greek diaspora, which supported the Greek government. And you can see the chain. Some countries don't have that kind of diaspora. Or it can be one with convictions that, in effect, dominate policy. Cuban diaspora in the US. A second and almost the last asset is, of course, affinity. The notion of somehow being a natural kin to the stronger power. The British and the special relationship have played that card before World War One, before World War Two, very successfully. They're trying to play it again. But that can be common language, that be a common political system, that can be even an empathic image of being weak, of having been historically wronged. Maybe even a little guilt, a little tinge of guilt in there, and that all becomes exploitable, usable. And then the final asset I want to talk about is policy focus. A great power, strong power, has the world to deal with. Think about all the issues that the U.S. Has to monitor, the U.S. government has to monitor. Then think about the great power, and it's large and strong. So it has all this economic stuff domestically, all these interest groups, all these factions. Oh man, that's an awful lot to deal with. Even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK could not concentrate only on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Deluged with other issues. And because of that, what you get is, in many of the stronger powers, filtering. That it's only 24 hours in the day, right? So how do you cope with the proliferation of issues? You filter. You simplify, you prioritize, you do all that sort of thing. Now let's take the weaker country. What does it have to worry about? Being pushed around by the stronger country. Suppose there's only 2 or 3 stronger countries that give a damn about a particular weaker country. Well, that's it. The answer is easy then. We concentrate on our relations with those 2 or 3. So if you think about it, let's take the case of Israel. Israeli pointed this out to me, that it is probable that when there's a serious bargaining going on, the serious influence attempt going on, that the Israeli participants will know an enormous amount more about the U.S. than the U.S. participants will know about Israel. Because after all, they're peers in office, in rank, as it were. But they are not peers in focused experience with the other party. Japanese if you're a Japanese on the fast track in their diplomatic service or their military, you will have been in the room when senior parties are dealing with the Americans. You will have been in the room probably for 20 or 30 years before you become the senior party dealing with the Americans. So the knowledge advantage of policy focus is enormous, even with unlikely places. Somalia, you remember Somalia went badly for us, which it surely did. All right. The leader of the Somali faction that gave us the hardest time, he spent years in the US. I don't think any of our leaders have spent a day in Somalia. So this experience, this sort of folk understanding of what has happened and how the great power thinks is asymmetric. So there we are. Now, final section moves. So what can the little guy do? Well, maybe quite a bit. Okay, cooperation credits. The great power, in this case, the US, likes thinking that our international efforts are not just us, they're multilateral. Right? Everybody except the bad guy is on our side. So the Mongolia, I mean, sure, yeah, Mongolia sends 20 military people to Iraq. Albania sends 50 military people to Iraq. Nobody would believe that that's going to make a difference in the combat in Iraq. What are they doing? They're accruing credits. Now, you may say, well, that's a pretty small credit. But hey, if you're small, small credits are worth having. Uh-huh. The more boldly, perhaps, small country gets a protector. They get a balancer. Right? This is as old as humankind, right? You know, you get somebody to help you with a bully. Uh, uh, so you've got a balancer or even a protector. So if you think about the Houthis, Houthis in Yemen these days, who do they have as a protector? Okay. So this getting a protector is again a old and familiar strategy, but that means if the great power should size their expectations accordingly, which would make them a little more concerned about how the pressure attempt would go. You could mobilize your diaspora. If you have a significant one. And that's certainly something we're familiar with. If the great power has a pretty permeable system, you can just hire people. You can hire people to work on your image, to work on how important you can be, how helpful you can be, how you're really a nice guy, a nice regime, and that can make a difference. You can say, oh, if only you'll compensate me and name a price which is a little high, but well, you can bargain about it. So you get some delay in the actions of the great power. One I like is to play up worse alternatives. So the Japanese, very knowledgeable Japanese, expressed it to me that, during the Cold War and since, but during the Cold War, there was a Japan Socialist Party. And the Socialist Party, in the American government view, was awfully pro-Chinese, sort of left, maybe communist influence, unreliable. You wouldn't want them to take over. So, as a Japanese friend explained to me, we would have had to invent the Socialist Party if it didn't already exist. So the idea was pressure from the Americans, response from the Japanese. Boy, that's going to strengthen the Socialist Party for the next election. So you're playing up worse alternatives. You may recall that in the Cold War, um, Poland almost broke with the Soviet Union, which was 1956, 57, after the Hungarian episode. And the Polish leader, communist, of course, opened the arms warehouses around Warsaw and let factory workers, gave them access to the weapons. But he was saying to the Russians, there's a worse alternative than me. There's a worse alternative than leaving us some internal room. And that worse alternative is you're going to have a war. And later, there was a military government in Poland, and that general did the same game with the Russians. He didn't open the arms warehouses, but he informed the Russians that I'm not everything you want, but the alternatives are okay. The saddest uh, alternative, of course, is well, maybe not the saddest, maybe the third saddest. Yes. Okay. This is why I have Emma. Okay. It's credible helplessness. That is, the weaker party says, hey, you're right. I would love to do it. I just can't. I can't. You know, my arms aren't strong enough to lift that. Right? Lebanon. The Lebanese have been playing that card for approximately 75 years. Okay, so hey, Lebanon, great power says to Lebanon, the Lebanese government at the time, could you please keep the Palestinians from attacking Israel? Or could you please suppress Hezbollah? Uh, and the Lebanese government says, oh, we'd love to, but we can't. We don't have the strength. Yeah, so credible helplessness is I'm suggesting a deliberate, thought through strategy. Now, it may be accurate. They may really be helpless, but now it's being used in ways that can be quite effective. Melting. Um, some years ago, I found one of the few then surviving copies of a book, a manual the U.S. Marine Corps had published in the 30s called the Small Wars Manual. And you may recall at the time the Marines were rather busy in Central America. So I read this yellowed, crumbly piece of thing, and what the Marines were talking about was we can't tell who the opposition is. You know, they don't wear uniforms. They just sort of disappear. And then we think, well, that's taken care of. And then wham, they're back. So the ability of the weaker party to basically disappear and then reappear a British commander who'd um, been responsible for Northern Ireland um, told me that at any one point in time, there were not more than 400 violently active uh, IRA separatists in Northern Ireland. Think about that. 400. Britain had Northern Ireland thoroughly penetrated. They had been there forever. They knew everything about Northern Ireland. They even had a large fraction of the population supporting their suppression of the IRA. They still couldn't do it. And I said, why? Of course. And the answer is melting. Melting, and then, of course, coming back. So the last one that I'll talk about is credible madness, insanity, insanity. In effect, saying, I don't care how much we get hurt as long as we can inflict pain. And so you could say, well, that must be a last resort. Sure. But if someone is like that, some group is like that, some government is like that, some movement is like that, you can't deter them. We can all think of examples, right? And that is the ultimate deprival of the success of the strong. Because after all, that kind of credible madness usually leaves a legacy of myth, right? Another origin story, which can then be used again and again and again over the centuries. So thank you. I'll welcome your comments. Let's see.
Thank you, Dave. How would you consider 3 years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine, where Russia was deemed a great, strong power and Ukraine a weak power? Okay? And yet Ukraine was able to repel Russian forces, and certainly months later with the assistance of the United States. But initially, the US and NATO were not helping out.
Okay, well, I think Russia was captured by the phenomena that Kennan and Morgenthau and Thucydides warned against: hubris, pride, arrogance, over-optimism. Because obviously Putin was not expecting and was not advised by his military intelligence people that it would be a lot harder than you expected. Now, what the Ukraine, first of all, had a truly painful, awful history with Russia, right? Which at least 2/3 of the Ukrainians were very aware of. Right? Secondly, we had been involved. We were training a Ukrainian guerrilla resistance before the Russians invaded. And so the notion of using the US and the EU as a balancer was well established among Zelensky's faction in Ukraine, right? And they had reason to believe, going back to um, the 80s, that important groups in Washington thought of Ukraine as a potential great asset to the US. I mean, think about it, technologically rather sophisticated, right? Rich agriculture, valuable primary metals, right? Big, and positioned to block off Russian access to the Black Sea. I mean, wonderful. What could be better? And a history of having been abused by Russia. Perfect. Huh? So they knew that idea was already circulating. Now, but they also knew and know that we'd abandoned them before. And the West Europeans had abandoned them before. Huh? So put that all in the stew, right? And I think that gives you a lot of explanation. They also had a significant diaspora here, and especially in Canada, who had been advising Ukrainian um, uh, anti-Russian groups beginning after wall fall. That's how I'd put that together. But now, if we talk about it, here we are, right? You see, things dragging on, right? And Putin, I think, and his faction really think and have thought that we wouldn't stick, right? We don't stick with things. Uh, and they have a different time perspective.
Dave, if I may, I was really intrigued with your last point about credible madness, and it occurs to me that during the Vietnam War, one of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong position was, we can do this for 20 years. How long can you do it? It was a kind of form of the credible madness issue. And that when Nixon got in, he used it as well.
That's right.
People telling them, hey, this guy's crazy. He's going to bomb you into obliteration. So it's not that the powerful countries don't have a lot of flexibility to make their power more effective as well.
Well, but Nixon, there were people in the U.S. who had one or two access shots. And there were disciples of Kennan in the U.S. government who opposed our adventure in Vietnam. There were people who briefed McNamara once, they never invited back, who knew quite a bit about Vietnam. There was a course being taught by a French military historian, right, who had analyzed the long war the French had been involved in Vietnam, right? All this was knowable. And we did try to bomb them back to oblivion. But there's some advantage to not being as fully modern. Oblivion is harder to get to. Depends on what you're used to. Depends on what you're used to having. It's not automatic. Oh dear, nobody's going to say, well, that was a crock. Oh yeah, here we go. I agree. I agree. And, kind of one of my few prophecies that came true. But why didn't we behave more wisely? See, that's the sort of haunting question. Well, bad advice, but bad frameworks. So I don't know how many of you recall the domino theory. See, the domino theory, if you believe it, says, oh, we couldn't just leave it alone, right? Because it would have automatically triggered disasters, right? It wouldn't have stopped in Vietnam. So that made it a war of necessity for the people who believed in the domino theory. And unfortunately, we had a president who, with all his wonderful attributes, thought these guys didn't believe he understood foreign affairs, that it was some exotic sort of thing, that only the best and the brightest understood. It was a depressing thought.
David, thank you very much for an extraordinary presentation.
My pleasure.